Thank you for being here. It is a real pleasure to be chairing this special panel on the myths of international relations. Some of you know, for over 2 decades, the discipline of international relations has undergone a wave of critical and revisionist scholarship that challenges long-standing narratives in the discipline. This panel addresses some of the most persistent myths that we still have in the discipline. The so-called first great debate, the supposed birth of the discipline in 1919, the centrality of anarchy in international relations, the concept of revisionism, and misconceptions about the League of Nations. Now, we have 4 very special guests today for our panel. All of them have contributed to revisionist work, either in history or international relations. And we're going to start with a researcher and professor at the Institute of International Studies, Universidad del Mar, who holds a PhD from the University of Miami and served as 𝐴MEI president from 2017 to 2019. His research focuses on IR theory, Mexico-US relations, and security studies. It's a pleasure to leave you with Dr. Alberto Lozano.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. Muy buenos días. Gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Good morning. Thank you for joining us to this panel. I am really happy that we have this panel with outstanding friends, and I'm really happy as well because I'm seeing very many familiar, friendly faces. Thank you so much for coming. Well, my participation deals with the epistemological myth of 1919, and I will try to provide a perspective from Mexico. Myths are common to humanity as much as to the disciplines of knowledge. In physics, there was the myth that matter is composed solely of indivisible and indestructible atoms. In chemistry, there was a myth that stated that Bohr's atomic model faithfully represents the behavior of electrons. Or, closer to us, in political science, the myth that voters make rational and well-informed decisions in a democracy. All these myths have been overcome with time, research, and evidence. Obviously, international relations, IR, is not the exception, as it is full of myths as the following. The discipline of IR was born in 1919. The first great debate between utopians and realists, the state as the only relevant actor, the international system is inherently anarchic and violent, the end of history and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government, and in the same line, the liberal international order is universal and natural. All of them function at some point as conventional knowledge, theoretical or historical, but endorsed and reproduced by certain epistemic communities, and that were useful either to make sense of the world or to construct the disciplinary history of IR. But in the end, they are all myths. An epistemological myth is a deeply held belief or dominant narrative within a theory of knowledge that presents itself as a universal truth, but in reality hides ideological, historical, or cultural assumptions. For example, the belief that science is completely objective and neutral. I want to focus my attention on the epistemological myth that our discipline of international relations was born in 1919. It is epistemic, I mean cognitive status, because it has been taught, transferred as valid knowledge in books, classrooms, and lectures.
I'm going to make an amendment to that, and I'm going to call it beyond revisionism. So moving toward beyond revisionism, this other interesting question arose is, when did this story start to take hold? When did this become part of the entrenched narrative that many introductory students have to suffer through and listen to? And interestingly, and this research is still going on, there's a couple articles that are going to be appearing shortly in very prestigious journals that argue that really it didn't take hold until much later. That perhaps it was in the context of the second great debate, which is often characterized as science versus traditionalist, or even the late 1980s when we thought we were in a third great debate, which was an inter-paradigm debate between liberals, realists, and good old Marxists. And the idea is that the great debate story would give the field coherence, right? That we could show, and again, in the US context, this notion of scientific progress is so important, right? So the idea that we've gone through a series of great debates, the field was unified between very coherent positions, and some of these, was really nostalgia. The idea that the discipline now is so pluralistic, it's so eclectic, there is no central core, that earlier that was not the case. All right. So the idea is that the story was retrospectively imposed on the past to give the discipline a sense of order, and that's why we have the stickiness of people not wanting to get rid of the idea that there was a first great debate. Now, moving on to post-revisionism, or what I want to probably call now beyond revisionism, was a very interesting article in 2005 by Quirk and Vigneswarren. And they called the first great debate, quote, a half-truth or highly distorted and overly simplistic caricature rather than a complete myth. So this article had very important for me, because I'm like, okay, I'm kind of a little guilty here, I guess. So this has pushed the historiographical moment on, that other people have now begun to do more and more research, and maybe there is some evidence of a debate, but not the way we typically characterize it. For example, I did recover a debate that was kind of cast in terms of idealism and realism, but it was in the 1950s, and it was about American foreign policy. This was Hans Morgenthau, who wrote an article in the American Political Science Review, which is the holy grail of political science journals, allegedly, and said another great debate, idealism versus realism, right? But this had nothing to do with the disciplinary history of international relations, right? Peter Marcus Christensen and Ole Weaver. Others have begun looking at the work of the International Studies Conference, which some argue is a predecessor to the International Studies Association. And this was part of the League, actually. And the ISC conferences took place between 1928 and the early 1950s. And in this article that they're soon to come forth, they look at the 1934-35 Conference on Collective Security and the 1936-1937 Conference on Peaceful Change. And here again, they find evidence of a debate between an idealist and realist camp, but there's full of surprises in their story. The realists turned out to be the Nazis who attended the conferences and actually were advocating for appeasement. And the idealist label were advocating collective security, right? And so they retrace this debate. They call it it's a debate of positions, right? Not necessarily theories or schools of thought. And their other argument, which is going to get me close to my closing time, is that they argue we can't get rid of the first great debate because in doing so would continue the silence and ignorance of what was happening before 1919. And here there seems to be an overwhelming amount of evidence, and I have to advise some of my own work, that the real context for the study of international relations was not war, but empire, imperialism, colonial administration, and more than ever, race. Fear of race wars, fear of how to manage the quote-unquote backward peoples of the world, how to have a science of colonial administration. And, in my book, again, I did not emphasize the role of race anywhere to the degree that I should have, but I showed the early meetings of the American Political Science Association. There was panel after panel on colonialism, right? And, thankfully through the work of Bob Vitalis, Black Power Politics, the role of race and how so many of our pioneer figures, unfortunately, were deeply racist individuals. All right. And Luke Ashworth, again, a classic revisionist who critiqued the interwar period, the idealist. He has an article that just appeared in 2022, and he is looking at some of the same figures that he looked at earlier, but from the vantage point of race. Right? So I think that is part of this beyond revisionist work of going back to the history that clearly predates 1919. And I could have much more to say that, but I'm out of time. And the last thing that is happening within this beyond revisionism is the work of feminist scholars, of looking at that this was not just a conversation of white men talking to white men. And I've just begun reading this book, but probably is going to be a landmark book, but Patricia Owen's brand new book, Erased. And this is the history of international relations without men. And the book is close to 400 pages. So there must have been a lot of discourse, scholarship produced by women during this period. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor Brian Schmidt. Ahora vamos a pasar a la tercera participación, en este caso de un historiador y profesor en el Colegio de México. Está especializado en la crisis de entreguerras, la Guerra Civil Española y las relaciones entre México y España. Es doctor por la Universidad Complutense de Madrid y autor de varios libros, incluyendo Inseguridad Colectiva, la Sociedad de Naciones, la Guerra de España y el Fin de la Paz, así como War in Spain, Appeasement, Collective Insecurity and Failure of European Democracies Against Fascism. Por favor, demos la bienvenida al doctor 𝐕𝐵 𝐺.
Buenos días, good morning. I'm going to deliver my presentation in Spanish because if I don't stick to the prepared manuscript, it will be hard for me to cover all the points I intend to cover within the scheduled time. So if after the panel someone has any question or any doubt in English, it's more than welcome. Los tiempos de aceleración histórica implican, por definición, procesos extraordinarios, ¿no? Y el periodo de entreguerras constituye un periodo de aceleración histórica único en el pasado conocido en términos de movilización político-ideológica de masas. Y de unas masas insertadas además de forma inédita en los asuntos públicos después de haber sido empleadas como carnaza de guerra entre 1914 y 1918. Un cambio histórico determinante en términos sociales, claro, también en otros, y derivado de aquella experiencia bélica y de la conformación del triángulo ideológico surgido de sus ruinas, el cual definiría el periodo de entreguerras. Una nueva realidad aterrizada con cierto grado de brusquedad implica nuevos patrones y escalas de valores, a nivel colectivo, pero también a nivel individual. Con frecuencia, dichos procesos son fuente de alteraciones, llegando a resultar perturbadores o incluso traumáticos. La necesidad de digerir el proceso y naturalizar el cambio conforme al nuevo escenario motiva una imposición relativamente rápida, al paso, de una explicación conformada por generalidades, donde no tienen cabida grandes matices. Se trata del terreno idóneo para la introducción de distorsiones aparentemente secundarias o la generación de vacíos explicativos. Se genera así un terreno para manipulaciones y adulteraciones futuras, ya sean más inconscientes o interesadas. El nuevo relato todavía no es historia. La prioridad es la adaptación al nuevo escenario presente y el establecimiento de proyecciones de futuro. Más aún que los vacíos explicativos, las distorsiones de apariencia relativa, no esencial, suelen resultar determinantes de cara a prefijar un relato histórico u otro. Por ello mismo, por esa apariencia a priori secundaria, resulta tan difícil reconfigurar o reformular líneas motrices interpretativas establecidas y asentadas en torno a un relato imperante o hegemónico. Los seres humanos a lo largo de toda la historia han sido generadores y propagadores de mitos. Las cuestiones de la muerte, la trascendencia y un mundo ulterior han estado intrínsecamente ligados a la mitología humana. Pero otras preocupaciones más terrenales, pero no por ello menos efectivas, han determinado la traslación del mito al quehacer científico, por más que a este se le presupone ser antítesis de aquello no explicable en términos de demostración y verificación. La historia, en cuanto a ciencia social, y esta es la visión de un historiador, no soy yo, no de un internacionalista, la historia ha sido particularmente vulnerable a la manipulación como arma de combate en clave presentista. Una primera línea de construcción del conocimiento histórico viene determinada por los focos del relato, que responden a marcos interpretativos a menudo preestablecidos, y por lo tanto no ciertamente originales, stricto sensu. Y responden también a grandes líneas narrativas que excluyen ciertos tabúes, a la par que influyen de forma determinante en la conformación de una escala de valores, con el fin de generar moral colectiva para instruir íntimamente en lo que debe ser y lo que no debe ser. En dicho terreno entra en juego la cuestión del revisionismo, semánticamente adulterado en clave peyorativa respecto a su significado original, y el papel de los guardianes de la historia, instrumentos del poder vigente. El relato es poder, y el poder tiene la capacidad y los medios para marcar el relato, en una relación simbiótica en la que los intermediarios se ven a menudo inmersos en una disyuntiva de posicionamiento equilibrado entre el rigor en la reconstrucción del pasado y un amolde no perjudicial de su expresión narrativa conforme a las premisas y necesidades del presente. Ello incide en la elección de temas de estudio, de marcos interpretativos, de perspectivas de abordaje y de base informativa de partida en todo proceso de investigación. Salirse del molde implica riesgos, con la fatal posibilidad de ser ignoradas las contribuciones en los relatos hegemónicos o, peor todavía, ser merecedor de una etiqueta, la de revisionista, con la mencionada connotación peyorativa en el saber científico contemporáneo. No obstante, en este punto cabe señalar que la necesidad de un revisionismo real, es decir, no en la proyección semántica que ha tenido el término, es parte esencial de la labor historiográfica, en cuanto a no dar por sentadas preconcepciones o asumir de antemano ciertos terrenos discursivos e interpretativos. De lo contrario, el historiador partiría limitado de antemano respecto a la generación de marcos interpretativos y el abordaje desde perspectivas originales, así como un lastre en forma de escepticismo o minusvaloración de nueva evidencia primaria surgida que resulte relevante, pero no encaje o sintonice con las líneas mainstream del conocimiento histórico generalizado o estandarizado. Cabría más paliar tal acepción peyorativa por otro término más descriptivo y no contaminante con su legítimo sentido de quehacer científico y académico. Pues no cabe confundir la necesidad de un revisionismo en estricto sentido, que resulta intrínseco al avance del conocimiento histórico conforme al acceso a nuevas fuentes, con el ruido generado por el relativismo, que ha llegado a infiltrarse perniciosamente en la academia, y el negacionismo, más propio de ámbitos sociales ajenos a la academia, disparados en su visibilidad y alcance a través de los nuevos medios de comunicación y redes sociales. Negacionismo que se vierte sobre hechos fehacientemente constatados en aras de una supuesta verdad alternativa o posverdad en términos más recientes. Si el interés radica en la construcción de un relato cuya columna vertebral se halla en la reconstrucción fidedigna y rigurosa de las mayores parcialidades posibles de hechos relevantes que conforman el pasado, entonces la importancia de matizar resulta ineludible. Sin embargo, los matices suelen ser incómodos de cara a la amplia permeabilidad de las narrativas hegemónicas. Se puede argumentar de forma razonable que el éxito en torno a las grandes permeabilidades sociales no permite pequeños detalles y disquisiciones. Las omisiones y el silencio ante matices aparentemente secundarios e incómodos, como cualquier matiz casi por definición, a la línea interpretativa general, forman parte del proceso de estandarización de narrativas. Algunos matices, sin embargo, pueden cobrar una semántica o dimensión muy diferente ante las inevitables reformulaciones del relato conforme al cambio de los tiempos. De ahí la necesidad de cultivar un riguroso y empíricamente sustentable relato interpretativo. En caso contrario, empezarán a aflorar las grietas en el edificio del gran relato, y algunas de ellas pueden resultar estructurales y, por ende, fatales. Contra las narrativas hegemónicas no resulta terreno cómodo ni de sencilla fertilidad el repensar problemáticas alejadas en su estudio y comprensión de los presentismos que definieron un relato bastante estático del periodo en el estudio y de sus coyunturas y dilemas. Por otro lado, con el paso del tiempo y el cambio de la escala de valores, colectiva e individual, surgen nuevas generaciones con una mayor o menor determinación de liberarse del peso de la historia, concebido como carga u obstáculo para la pertinente canalización de las energías hacia un nuevo mundo, un mundo fresco, digamos. En tal problemática se inserta un fenómeno contemporáneo como el de la llamada memoria histórica, como búsqueda de un relato colectivo conforme a líneas rojas. Consecuencias visibles para el conjunto de la sociedad son, por ejemplo, el derribo de monumentos, el renombramiento de calles y otras medidas de carácter esencialmente político, ergo presentista. Ello no constituye una crítica en sí. El juicio de la historia, si bien dinámico y cambiante, ciertamente existe y se constata socialmente. Historia e identidad han tenido, tienen y tendrán un vínculo indisoluble. Y en estos tiempos se está viendo con toda claridad. La cuestión estriba en cómo armonizarlo con un mínimo de decencia y rigor. Bien, quisiera adentrarme un poco en el terreno que constituyó, digamos, el papel que tuvieron los mitos, cómo se proyectaron los mitos durante el periodo de entreguerras a través de Sociedad de Naciones, a través de la narrativa hegemónica en torno a las consecuencias directas emanadas del Tratado de Versalles, y también cómo ello sirvió para la minusvaloración del apaciguamiento británico, del appeasement, como un elemento crítico a la hora de desencadenar una Segunda Guerra Mundial, digamos, con una sociedad de naciones cuyo objetivo esencial había sido precisamente evitar una nueva guerra como la que había tenido lugar entre 1914 y 1918, ¿no? He aquí, pues, un ejemplo muy claro sobre cómo los relatos opacan ciertas dimensiones clave en función de intereses presentistas en clave política, como fueron los de la Segunda Posguerra Mundial, momento en el que se asentó la visión hegemónica de lo que había sido la crisis de entreguerras, ¿no? ¿Qué cabría diferenciar en dos décadas muy diferentes entre sí, como fueron los años 20 y la crisis de entreguerras en sí iniciada a inicios de los años 30, coincidiendo nada casualmente con la inauguración de la política exterior británica en clave de appeasement?
He holds doctorates in both international relations and history. He has taught at Yale, Berkeley, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, TEC de Monterrey, Anáhuac, and obviously in the best university in the world, UMAR. His research focuses on international law, IR theory, and history of the discipline. Please welcome Dr. 𝐕𝐵𝒆.
Muchas gracias, es un honor nuevamente estar por aquí con ustedes. I have my ideas originally developed in Spanish because they were written for the book that Dr. Villanueva is now promoting, but since the idea was to share this with the wider ISA community, then I decided that I was going to present it in English. When Dr. Villanueva originally proposed the idea of a new book, I was very excited because the first experience was really thrilling in many ways. Writing the chapters and then touring the country, presenting the book, and it was really a fantastic experience. And so when he said that he had this idea for a new book, then I immediately figured, yeah, count me in. He then told us that his idea was to work on the myth of international relations, not even after that day, because the nation itself is a very recent phenomenon, dating perhaps from the 19th century onwards. And so I thought, well, where are we standing, really? And then when I started looking at the discourse regarding the nature of the discipline and the breadth of the discipline and the scope of the discipline, then I found in literature that there was no actual debate about IR being a discipline at all until the mid-50s, perhaps, when Hoffman thought that it'd be a good idea to have a discipline of IR on its own merits, following perhaps the lead of Quincy Wright, who first suggested the idea. And then some of the pioneers in the area, like Kaplan or Martin White, wrote seminal works denying the disciplinary nature of IR and saying it's absurd, it's a field of inquiry. And then yesterday I discussed the topic again and made the difference. And some colleagues asked me afterwards, is this still on a debate, really? Like, we all agree that IR is a field of study, not a discipline. And that if you want to explore it, then you have to look at it from an interdisciplinary perspective. And some colleagues even told me that maybe IR was better seen as a community, or even that the disciplinary concern was an example of masculine anxiety for orderly stuff, which is probably true. My wife would agree with that, I guess. In any case, I thought, where are we standing? Is there a discipline starting when? Does it relate to the field of study? Since when? And so it turns out the whole thing is still quite messy. But within the mess, it is important that some people are devoted to straightening it out somehow or other, even if it's only masculine anxiety. So, independently of the date of birth, I believe there is a need for discipline, an all-embracing discipline of international relations. And I believe this is the result of an intellectual effort to understand the practical side, the field of observation, which we call international relations as well. And through this intellectual effort, we make representations of the international scenario. We try to figure out what it looks like, how it works, how it evolves, and so on and so forth. And we find that it may be possible to discover a field of inquiry which could be called international relations way back to antiquity, if instead of thinking of IR as interaction amongst nations, we think of IR as awareness of the other. Because when you realize the otherness, there's someone else out there, then one way or another you have to react to that other presence. And so that gives you a very wide scope of interaction, phenomena, and reflection on that phenomena, which a lot of historical revisionists have found out. Okay, now, following a historical line of evolution of IR as a field of inquiry, and until the time it gets to become a discipline, you find that there are some continuities and evidently some change. So the representation you make of the international scenario will largely depend on the assumptions that you start from. And so if you focus on the continuities, then you tend to build up narratives which are essentially ahistorical, no history, universal values, and to view long-term structures which are always present there. But if you try to focus on the changing side of it, then you find that at different times in history, the international system, if you want to look at it that way, has had different stages of development and different specificities. So is it valid to talk about international relations in the 20th or 21st century in the terms that you would speak about international relations during the Middle Ages? Well, a dialectical response would be yes and no. It depends. If you look at the continuities, there are certain aspects that are still there. And if you look at it from the size of fluency, mobility, then the answer has to be no, because current IR phenomena have their own specificity, which was not there in the Middle Ages. And so you have to be very careful to focus in a balanced way, depending on what you want to talk about. And what I found is that the myth of anarchy is one of the most persistent continuities in the narrative about the presence of the other. So international relations in the broader sense. And you find out this if you go back to ancient literature like Thucydides or Hobbes, or even if it's not mentioned by name, the idea of anarchy contemplated from the original meaning of the Greek word, without leadership. It's there. And it's one of the main variables to be considered when you want to analyze the nature of the system you're looking at. So if anarchy is present throughout history, then why would you call it myth? Well, that depends a lot on what you take anarchy to be. And if you look at it from a realist perspective, and you consider that anarchy is an unchanging structure which inevitably leads to conflict, and there's nothing you can do about it except prepare yourself, then, of course, your diagnosis for political foreign policy will be headed in that direction. But if you take a different view and contemplate anarchy as a variable that one way or another can be modified, in other words, if you contemplate the possibility of cooperation among states beyond the idea of the natural enmity with the other, then anarchy becomes a structure which is a lot more flexible and that you can manipulate. I think that's how Alexander Wendt came to the idea that anarchy is what the states make of it. Anarchy is still important. It's an idea that you can't just eliminate. Every school of thought, every theoretical approach will have to contemplate the notion of power, the notion of anarchy, the notion of cooperation, so on and so forth. It really depends where you want to put the emphasis that will determine the nature of your own theoretical work. Myths are necessary. Myths are part of the natural psychology of humans. Yeah. Marriage is good. It's a myth. Marriage is indispensable. Love is the guiding force of life. Well, yeah. It also depends on what meaning you give to each one of these concepts that you're using. And in that respect, I think, just to conclude, first, the evolution of the human species from dawn till today would not have been possible if cooperation had not been a key element of interaction with the others. And structures which form themselves through interaction can be changed, can be modified, and are currently the only hope in the face of a state system, of an international system composed of individual states whose capacity is never enough in this day and age to tackle the type of problems that we are facing. So if we still think that anarchy will lead the way, we're headed towards doomsday. And I hope it's not the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarkis. I should say that this panel, Professor Sarkis actually mentioned it. The reason of this panel is because we're working in a book, a volume on the myths of international relations. All the panelists are writing a chapter of the book, myself as well. And we have other important revisionists who have contributed to the volume as well, such as Patricia Owens, Lucian Ashworth, John Hobson, yeah, of course, Brian Schmidt, and a couple of others. So we are very much looking forward to that book. Having said that, it's kind of weird for me to critique the chapters of my own book. So it's kind of strange. So I'm going to probably just have some questions, one question for each, because I agree with them in a lot of ways, and I'll give the rest of the time for questions and answers from you. So first, Professor Lozano, you said that, and it is true, we have found some resistance in Mexico about the traditional narrative in international relations about 1919. So is there something to be done? Like, should we do something or just leave it like that? You know, does it really matter to do something? Now, on Professor Schmidt's contribution, your paper is, of course, an excellent piece of work, and your work in general is focused on the U.S. And you mentioned that imperialism is key in the early stages of the discipline, and you have a book on that, right? At least one book is specifically on that. Now, I wonder why the paper doesn't mention the debate that Norman Angell had with several primarily British intellectuals in the interwar period, like Henry Brailsford, Leonard Woolf, about whether or not capitalism was the cause of imperialism and war in general. A question now for Professor David Jorge. Quisiera saber un poco sobre la Sociedad de Naciones y el fracaso de la misma, ¿no? En RI tendemos a decir que la Sociedad de Naciones fracasó rotundamente en su trabajo. Yo sé que en parte tú lo dices, pero ¿cuál es tu opinión al respecto? ¿Realmente fue un fracaso total? ¿No hay nada que rescatar de esa organización? ¿No debemos escribir sobre ella, sobre lo que hizo? ¿Solo la dejamos atrás? And finally, the question for Professor 𝐂𝐨𝐧𝐿. One of your key arguments is that realists argue that anarchy leads to conflict, right? But we should change that kind of thought, right? And it seems to me that because anarchy can be either cooperation or conflict, it seems to me that this argument sounds like constructivism a lot. How does your argument differ from a constructivist perspective? Is it different at all, or are you adopting a constructivist perspective? So, Alberto, would you like to start?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. So the question is there something to be done? I would say yes. We are doing that we are supposed to do as scholars, as professors. And that's why I like this quote from Professor William Irvine. Paraphrasing his quote is, our goal is not to change people's minds, but to make them question the things they believe. And what we are doing now, what did we do in 2019? We published a book. We invited respectable, important authors. We organized a conference. We presented the book in private and public universities, trying to make some diffusion about these new ideas. And I think we accomplished with intellectual responsibility our goal. Our achievement was to shake that kind of knowledge that we assume it is true, because it is in me, myself, in the PhD experience, I learned this myth as a valid knowledge, because it is backed by important publishers like Oxford and Springer and Palgrave and so on. But we are a kind of minority struggling against something that is any more sustainable. So I would say yes, and that's why I said this panel makes a lot of sense with that goal. We are trying to push this agenda, and I feel really proud of it. Thank you. Sorry.
I actually like question one better than my question. I mean, I'm going to do both. I traveled far. It's astonishing to me that as more, yes, my first book did focus on the United States. I made that absolutely clear. I also made it absolutely clear that that's not the only way to look at this. And I have made olive branches or calls for more people to do historiography of their discipline within their own country, because likely it would be a very different story than the one that's told in the UK and the US. But what's astonishing, as I've met more and more people, is that this story is entrenched in other countries that have no part of this whatsoever. I mean, I recently had a PhD student from Colombia, and he was telling me that the first great debate in idealism, realism is entrenched in the story that Colombia tells about the history of IR. And when I first met these folks, that it was entrenched in Mexico, right? There was nothing about colonialism and empire and, you know, the fact that the United States stole a chunk of this country. But yet we go back to interwar idealists and that the discipline started with World War I. So it's astonishing. But to hear that there is resistance of the revisionist work that these incredible scholars here are doing is in some sense not surprising, right? You know, when I started off, I was naive. I thought, you know, once we got more and more work and more evidence, that textbooks would have to stop telling this story because it was just wrong. But, you know, you do a search of textbooks and you have to search very hard for any textbook that even wants to challenge the story or have a footnote that people are, you know, saying this isn't really correct. So this is a short chapter. He didn't give us a lot of words, so I guess that's my easy answer. I could only do so much in this chapter, and there's much more that I do want to do. In my book, I did deal with Lenin and imperialism, and you know, Lenin's argument that World War I really had nothing to do with the European powers, that World War I was about capitalist countries dividing up the world, and suddenly there wasn't much world to divide up, and that was a major cause of World War I. And Norman Angell, you know, he's been, you know, that's the other thing, right? When you do a superficial count of all of this, you get, you know, claims of what writers wrote that when you actually read their book or their articles, it's like it's like this, I don't know, head explosion. It's like, but they're saying something completely different than what the secondary literature says. So Angell was no woolly-eyed idealist who said war doesn't pay and we should just stop, right? There was a deep economic argument and interdependence and other key ideas in The Great Illusion, right? And I do look at Luke Ashworth's new piece, who did a lot to establish the history of international thought as a field. And I think in response to David's comments, I think we do have to make distinctions between disciplinary history and intellectual history and the history of ideas. Because of course we could say people have been thinking about something about interaction of communities, maybe back to Thucydides. But it's a great myth to think that Thucydides was a member of the academic discipline of IR, which clearly did not exist at all in 400 BC. And so anyway, in Luke Ashworth's new piece, he does go back and look at Mahan, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan and Norman Angell, but from the point of race, and nobody comes out looking very good.
Well, your question will need a full long conference to be answered. So, well, of course, the League of Nations failed, but the point is how and why did the League of Nations fail? And I would say it failed essentially because the member states with more power within the organization, starting by the UK, had other priorities. And appeasement, in the end, turned out to be the barrier of collective security and the League of Nations. Well, that would be the short answer, right? If you want me to talk about appeasement and collective security, then I will need at least an hour and a half.
I think we can skip that. Thank you very much. Thank you for from the three. Thank you to the three of you. And so now we go to questions and answers after 𝐉𝐶𝐬𝐧𝐿, of course.
Very quickly, I don't especially like tags. They're limiting, and they're, like it has been said, straitjackets, and they put you in a position where if you are not in line with a certain number of ideas supposedly established to distinguish the tag, then you're eclectic or you simply don't know what you're talking about. So, no, I mean, I have read constructivist accounts, and I have read the theory that upholds the constructivist view. You know me for years, and I've been working from a systemic approach for almost 40 years now. But it's not the basic limited idea of a system that Bertalanffy presented back in the 1940s or 50s, or that the social sciences brought into their fields during the 50s and 60s in sociology, political science, and finally IR. I think that as a good theory should do, it evolves. If a theory is reasonably good, it tends to grow into a meta theory through the contributions of different people who face challenges or see deficiencies, and then try to build on to accommodate to new circumstances. It's not just changing the theory at pleasure, it's trying to overcome limitations. And this normally happens in every theory. There's hardly one single version of realism, depends who you're talking about, or one single version of Marxism. You know, there are a whole bunch of different branches inspired on a general idea and then building up on it. Current systems thinking has basically relational ontology. Things come to exist from interaction, and has a solid epistemology, trying to figure out if the system behaves as a system. There are some established ideas about what the properties of systems are. And in that respect, constructivism could be seen as a branch of evolutionary systems theory.
Thank you. Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sarkis. Now we open the floor for questions and answers. Any questions? Can
Nada más
someone help
quisiera
me?
decir, animar a los estudiantes, que hagan preguntas, pueden hacer preguntas en español. Si son para el Dr. Brian Schmidt, podemos traducirlas al inglés, pero la idea es estimular el diálogo. Con toda confianza, hagan sus preguntas.
¿Sí? ¿Lo oyen?
Sí.
Sí. Okay, I'm sorry. I want to make my question in Spanish. Es una pregunta para todo el panel. ¿Dónde queda la paz de Westfalia en su análisis? La paz de Westfalia, Westphalia Peace. Hay dos textos importantes ahí. Uno de Kissinger en el libro World Order, en donde plantea que Westfalia inventa el Estado moderno, obviamente no universal, pero en Europa, y que la balanza de poder fue la clave para entender la relación entre los estados europeos y mantener la paz o hacer la guerra, y hasta para expandirse en el colonialismo. Luego hay otro autor también que no es americano. Kissinger era alemán finalmente y pensó como alemán. Michel Foucault, que hace una genealogía también del Estado moderno. No es un texto que publicó, sino una de sus clases que ya está publicado, que se llama Territorio, Población, donde plantea también que Westfalia, para muchos historiadores, es el fin de Roma. La idea de que la noción de imperio podía seguir después de Roma, pero bajo la Iglesia católica. Y la gran perdedora es España, porque Westfalia plantea de que cada estado decide la religión que quieran elegir, ¿no? Dentro del cristianismo. Y que la noción de soberanía y de balanza de poder, muy influidos por los físicos newtonianos de la época. O sea, no hay que ver que hay una invención de relaciones internacionales por internacionalistas, eso no existía, pero son los físicos de la época y los tradición jurídica sobre la soberanía que sienta las bases de una razón de Estado para Francia o de una ciencia de la policía, ¿no? Polizeiwissenschaft, así le llamaban, tanto en Alemania como en Italia, los que generan las bases para pensar un orden internacional, al menos europeo. Y curiosamente, dice Kissinger después, esas ideas prevalecen hasta ahora, y quizás ahora tendríamos que regresar justamente a esta idea de balanza de poder, de equilibrio de fuerzas, muy dentro de la tradición, ya no newtoniana, pero quizás dentro de la física cuántica o de nuevos enfoques de la inteligencia artificial que hoy tenemos. Es una pregunta para todos.
Sí, vamos a tomar 3 preguntas. Esa pregunta probablemente el profesor David Sarkis sea el adecuado. También podría nuestro historiador decir algo, pero bueno, ya veremos. María Andivi. ¿Hay alguien más por acá? Adelante. Ahí están esos 3.
Buen día, gracias por la presentación. Para mí es un gusto ponerle rostros a ustedes porque recuerdo el libro de 2019 sobre los 100 años de relaciones internacionales. No sabía que eran justamente ustedes. Me complace, creo que además la presentación es una buena introducción, bueno, generan expectativas sobre este nuevo libro. Y 3 puntos, sé que no tenemos mucho tiempo, pero quisiera saber detalles sobre la manera en que estructuran este libro. Y lo pienso a propósito de 2 cosas que me surgen con sus presentaciones. Por lo menos en Sudamérica, las relaciones internacionales como disciplina son muy novedosas. Y yo pienso que tal vez los mitos convencionales no están tan bien establecidos como en la disciplina en el ámbito anglosajón y tal vez seguramente también en México. Pienso si a propósito de lo que ustedes están discutiendo, a nosotros como docentes nos resultaría más eficaz enseñar estos mitos para desmontarlos, porque tal vez lo que hay es mucha distorsión y normalmente estamos construyendo conocimiento a partir de una visión simplificada y distorsionada de los mitos. Entonces me preguntaría qué piensan ustedes sobre si nosotros con nuestros estudiantes deberíamos movernos en un nivel, bien sea de desmontar los mitos directamente, cuando tal vez lo conveniente sea entrar en la discusión de cómo, por qué se forjaron esos mitos, que es un reto grande porque también en el proceso formativo eso tomaría bastante tiempo, pero es como esa apuesta metodológica que ustedes hacen, qué implicaciones pedagógicas tiene. Y lo otro que me llama la atención, bueno, tenemos mitos muy bien establecidos que son mitos históricos clásicos. Ustedes han hablado de los mitos de la disciplina 1919, 1939, 1945. Tal vez ya también estaríamos hablando de nuevos mitos. Tal vez hay mitos disciplinares que se han construido y se han venido estableciendo en el escenario posguerra fría que también deberíamos evaluar y si tal vez van teniendo la misma fuerza que tienen estos mitos tradicionales.
Gracias. Siguiente pregunta, por favor.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentations. I'll try to be brief with my questions. How can we overcome dominant myths in narratives in international relations, or even what specific dominant myths in international relations need revisionism, and how can we challenge them? Thank you.
Do you say dominance means?
Myths.
Hello, my name is Maria. I am an international relations student here at UMAR. My question is, by considering 1919 as the year our discipline was born, are we ignoring or perhaps dismissing a few or any important, or any important precedents or antecedents? I believe Professor Sarkis mentioned a few. And if so, are those precedents or antecedents relevant enough to consider this idea not only a myth, but a mistake? That's my...
Gracias. Yo creo que pues va diciendo cada quien las preguntas que quiere tomar. Le cedo la palabra primero al doctor Sarkis.
I found the first question quite interesting because we have a chapter in the book about 1648, and it's written, that one chapter, by one of the best known historical revisionists, 𝒚𝒆 𝐬𝐵, 𝒚𝒆, el apellido 𝐂𝐮𝐧𝐿. It's a wonderful book. It's worth reading. And in that book, of course, he mentioned that 1648 is a valid turning point for a number of things. It's not necessarily the end of an era or the beginning of a new era, but there are some specific changes that you can look at. It's not the birth of the nation state, as some authors have suggested. It's more like the change of the dynastic state to the territorial state. Because before that, a territory belonged to a monarch, and there was a dynasty ruling, and the territory could change hands through war or marriage arrangements, or a whole bunch of different ways. So from 1648 onwards, you start seeing a more clearly delimited idea of a territorial state instead of a dynastic state. And also the idea of sovereignty, which is not necessarily from that date. The notion of sovereign as applied to the modern state is a contribution of the French an advisor to King Francis, who quarreled throughout the 16th century with the Emperor Charles V. And of course, the King of France hated this young fella who had defeated him in the race to the chair of the empire. And so the king asked for advice as to how to avoid a duty that he had to his lord, the emperor, being his vassal, but a very strong vassal because France was the most important kingdom in the area. And so the notion of sovereignty was brought back to life to suggest that you don't have to give any account of what you're doing in your territory to anyone else but you. You are the highest authority here, and that's it. So that's why 1648 is a special turning point. But in this new chapter that 𝐂𝐨𝐧𝐿 has written for us, he adds some other seminal dates that can be considered as turning points. 1713 with the Peace of Utrecht, or 1763 with the Peace of Paris, which puts an end to the 7-Year War, which apparently was the first real world war fought in Asia, Europe, and America. So basically, that's the idea.
Gracias. Siguiendo la instrucción, voy a responder la que me gustaría responder. Profesor, muchas gracias por leer el libro. Rápidamente, es un reto pedagógico enseñar esto, ciertamente, pero lo que yo le digo a mis propios estudiantes, que incluso están aquí para la clase de teorías de RI, es que, porque el reto es que dices, bueno, estos son mitos, pues ya te los omites y entonces enseñas el material nuevo. Pero en mi opinión no puedes criticar algo que no conoces. Tienes que conocer primero lo que es criticable y después analizarlo, ¿no? Entonces tienes que, lo que yo enseño es como la historia tradicional, ¿no? La narrativa tradicional, y cito varios libros importantes de casas editoriales importantes que reproducen el mito, pero después viene la advertencia de leer contribuciones de revisionistas muy acreditados en las comunidades epistémicas de relaciones internacionales para que cuestionen y las razones de por qué se tiene que cuestionar esto. El problema de no enseñar los mitos es que actualmente, por ejemplo, en el examen de conocimientos generales para obtener el título de egresado de RI por el Ceneval, hay muchos reactivos o preguntas que siguen reproduciendo el mito. Entonces les van a preguntar sobre eso, tienen que conocerlo. Pero la idea es que den un paso más adelante conociendo esta literatura y esta reflexión crítica. Y el punto que comenta sobre posverdad me parece súper importante, los nuevos mitos en tiempos de posverdad, ¿no? Porque un mito en la escuela tradicional, pues lo desbancas con evidencia, ¿no? Historiográfica, que vas a los archivos y pruebas, armas el rompecabezas historiográfico. Pero ahora en tiempos de posverdad, el tema es que ya la verdad es irrelevante. No importa que hagas la investigación científica y muestres la evidencia. Ese es un reto importante de cómo enseñar mitos. Ahora tenemos la variable de redes sociales, que es un acelerador de la posverdad, ¿no? Yo lo voy a dejar ahí.
All right, I'm going to try to address the 2 questions by the students, which is, I think, an amazing part of this conference. As far as the dominance of myths, I'll be old-fashioned for a bit and say that there is something called truth. Facts do exist, and that, to have the courage to, do your research, do it well, and challenge these myths. I mean, that's, I think, the beauty of this historiographical moment, right? It's not a moment. It's a long-term project that has included lots of different people from different countries, different genders. And, you know, if you're interested in Patricia Owen's new book, Erased, right? I mean, the scholarship is absolutely impeccable. The archival research, the diaries, how she's gathered this information to say that women have always been a part of this quote unquote field. They have made very meaningful contributions, but it's been ignored. It's been erased. It's not been taken as serious. Right? And then Maria's question, you know, if we start in 1919, you know, what are we missing? I think you know, for me recently, the biggest thing is the role of race. And it's not as if that vanishes, you know, as the discipline evolves and grows. I mean, when you read Bob Vitalis' work and look at some of these key early figures, and race war was their biggest concern. And they bought hook, line, and sinker that white Anglo race was the superior race, which was allegedly factually determined. Feminism, you know, it wasn't something that you know, it's one interesting thing about our field is that really important, interesting trends start somewhere else and they come to our field like 15, 20 years later. I mean, how was it that we discovered feminism in the 1980s? So early feminism, she says, clearly existed before 1919. And I think the question of empire. So David was talking about anarchy, anarchy, anarchy. A lot of these people pre-1919 were really talking about hierarchy. You know, a hierarchy of races, a hierarchy of countries. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's missing if we just started 1919.
Yo no sé si los mitos son necesarios, ya sea en la vida o en el mundo académico, ¿no? Pero lo que desde luego es fascinante como tarea académica es, en relación con lo que mencionaba ahora Alberto, es una necesidad, eso sí, académica, es ver qué hay detrás de los mitos, el porqué de los mitos, ¿no? Y qué esconden, ¿no? Lo que esconden, ¿no? Y por qué lo esconden y cómo lo esconden. Es decir, y esa sí es, digamos, una verdad a desentrañar y un reto intelectual indudable y eso sí necesario, ya no académicamente solo, sino socialmente necesario, ¿no?
Thank you to all of you. Unfortunately, we have passed the time, so we have to finish the panel, but thank you all for being here.